Federal Cabinet today signed off on the referendum question that will be put to Australians on the Voice and on the proposed new chapter of the Constitution establishing the Voice. Both will now be debated by the Parliament. It was an emotional day for Indigenous leaders, almost 6 years after the Uluru Statement from the Heart and after decades of frustration trying to be heard. Shortly, we will be joined by one of the young Indigenous leaders advocating for the Voice. But first, a veteran of so many attempts to be heard, Marcia Langton, was asked at today's press conference to respond to criticism that previous advisory bodies hadn't delivered intended outcomes and why the Voice would be different.
Yes, there have been many advisory groups and consultative groups and councils. There's no evidence to suggest that they didn't work. But what has happened in most cases is that with each election, a party will use as its appeal to the voters that it will get rid of this XYZ body because it's clear that it's not working. And that's happened, I think we reckoned 7 times in our history. We have doggedly recommended changes to stop the deaths, the incarceration, the early deaths and the miserable lives, and it is so infrequently that our recommendations are adopted. We're here to draw a line in the sand and say this has to change, people's lives have to improve, and we know from the evidence that what improves people's lives is when they get a say, and that's what this is about.
One of the other people in the room, as Marcia Langton made that very emotive statement today, was Thomas Mayo, who's another member of the referendum working group. Thomas Mayo, it was an incredibly emotional day for everybody today, and Marcia Langton has been such a warrior for change for so long. Her comments really go to the historical heart of the problem, don't they? That is that the history of bodies that have made recommendations but have never been listened to and have then been wiped out by the next government to come along. Is that the heart of what the Voice offers, that you have to be listened to and that you can't be got rid of?
Yeah, it's at the heart of why this must be constitutionally enshrined, because we understand that if a voice is merely legislated, then we're setting ourselves up to failure. Maybe not in this generation, but maybe a future generation. Over and over again, we've established a voice to simply advise parliaments about the decisions that they make and to bring some accountability. And any time that's happened, they've silenced it. So the constitutional enshrinement of this, the coming referendum, is absolutely vital to getting change and seeing that consistency of listening to us.
Well, so there are lots of questions about the structure of the actual body that will still be debated. Peter Dutton says he still wants more detail. But today is really about that constitutional question that will be put in the referendum and the nature of the proposed new chapter in the Constitution. Could we just talk about the sorts of issues that the reference group has been working on, and where were the areas that you needed to find agreement with the government?
Well, in reality, the entire referendum is about the words that were released today. It is not about how the model will work. We're simply being asked, all Australians are simply being asked if we agree with having in our Constitution the principle that there should always be the ability for Indigenous people to speak to their interests and to provide the solutions to the Parliament. And what we've been doing as a referendum working group, working with the government, has been trying to reach a balance of words that will be acceptable to the Australian people, that is true to the intent of what this is, which is the principle of a voice, to ensure that it is not seen or will not be a third chamber to Parliament with no right to veto. But strong enough to ensure that there, as we talked about a bit earlier, that there will always be the ability for us to speak and to be heard, and to cause politicians to think about what we're saying from our communities.
So some of the changes that have been made are that there's an explicit reference to recognition being tied to the voice in the proposed wording, and a compromise, as I understand it, where Indigenous people were concerned that the original wording was too narrow in terms of the potential powers the Parliament might have to legislate about what the voice could do. Isn't this really about what the powers of the Parliament are over the voice, rather than what the power of the voice would be?
Well, the intent has always been to establish a voice that cannot be silenced by future governments that don't want accountability or don't want to listen to Indigenous people. And that is what these words do. The rest of it needs to be flexible. So, as I mentioned, this is about the principle of if Indigenous people should have a say to improve their lives. That is the principle. The rest of it needs to be flexible to improve the organisation, to change with the national interests. The other representative bodies that Marcia talked about that have always been silenced, they too should have been able to improve, to evolve with to become more democratic, to ensure that the grassroots were listened to deal with any issues, just like any other organisation has the ability to do. And so there's the principle, and then there's the detail, the model. And we're really just voting on if we should enshrine a voice.
How do you see it working in practice? Can you give us some examples of how you see the voice working?
At any stage of the development of policy and legislation, we should be able to be involved, and especially at the earliest stages, because our experience is, and the evidence shows, that any time the best policies, the most successful programs have always come when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are deeply involved, when they're able to lead those programs as well. And that's the most practical thing that we can do for our communities, because when we talk about policy and legislation, we're talking about, how housing, that all of our communities have issues with crowded housing. We all have issues with the justice system and how programs are run. There's common issues across our communities, and with a voice that can be at every step of the decision making, we're going to see the best results in all of those areas.
And just finally, I suppose one of the other things is there has been this reference to all these various bodies over the years. What's the importance of the voice as being a coherent body to government, whether it's at the federal, state or local level?
Not only the people that are being represented will see what our representatives are saying on our behalf, but all Australian people will see what we have to, will hear what we have to say. We'll know that the politicians that they elect have heard that, and if they ignore that advice and they continue to get things wrong and things keep getting worse, then that brings accountability. And I think that's a powerful thing and such an important reason why people should support this.
Thomas Mayo, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Laura.